Let me put this out simply. I am biased towards the US, just because I love many things the US has to offer. I love their American pop culture. I like the ideas in their American dream, and of course, the American ideals on democracy and freedom. How could I not? My country was under American rule before and after World War II. We learned a lot from them and copied a lot from them too. My country and our society had greatly been Americanized. From where I come from, our city is nicknamed Little America because a lot of Americans helped develop that city. That is why it is easy for me to love many things American. Then, the Iraq War happened. This greatly changed how I saw America that time. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, also known as Operation Iraqi Freedom, was a military campaign led by the United States and its allies, including the UK, Poland, and Australia. The invasion marked the beginning of the Iraq War. The 2003 invasion caused the reshaping of the political landscape of the Middle East and sparking a global debate on the use of military force against Iraq. The effects of this war from 20 years ago can still be observed and felt up to this day. The 2003 Iraq invasion was rooted in the aftermath of the Gulf War decades ago, in the 9/11 attacks, in the alleged plans to control Iraq's oil fields, and in the allegations of Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. The invasion unfolded against a backdrop of complex international relations, questionable intelligence and information shared, convincing the peoples of nations that the war is the only way for world peace to be attained, and divergent motivations among the coalition of nations involved in that invasion. This video will try to present a summarized timeline of key moments leading to the Iraq invasion and the removal of Saddam Hussein. But before I start, I want to clarify that I am in no way promoting any sort of political ideas, nor am I proclaiming support for any side. My goal is to just tell a story. Lastly, if by the end you like this content, may I humbly ask you to click on the subscribe button? Doing research and making videos like this takes a lot of my time, and it would really help motivate me to make content like this if I see my sub count increase to at least 1. Okay, with those out of the way, here's a brief timeline of the moments that led to the invasion of Iraq. Chapter 1. A Prelude. 1990 to 1991 saw the Gulf War happened. Strong opposition to the Saddam Hussein regime began following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. The international community condemned the invasion by Iraq, leading to a coalition of international forces led by the United States under President George H.W. Bush, the father, pushing Iraqi forces out of Kuwait.
Of countries to liberate Kuwait.
Iraq will not be permitted to annex Kuwait.
After the Gulf War, Iraq was subjected to United Nations sanctions, weapons inspections, and no-fly zones. The US and its allies tried to keep Saddam Hussein in check with a policy of containment. Of course, all these punishments didn't please Saddam, but something that surely pleased him was the decision of the Bush administration to allow him to stay in power and not overthrow his regime. The administration's reasoning was that overthrowing Saddam would have had many unnecessary political and human costs. I have to highlight this reasoning by the elder Bush's administration, as many years later, when Bush, the son, overthrows Saddam successfully, the same reasoning was used against the younger Bush, causing unnecessary political and human costs. Time passed, and tensions between Iraq and the international community grew over disarmament issues. Around this time is now where weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, became an important talking point when tackling issues involving Iraq and Saddam. In the decade following the Gulf War, the United Nations passed 16 Security Council resolutions calling for the complete elimination of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. However, member states communicated their frustration over the years that Iraq was impeding the work of Special Commission and failing to take seriously its disarmament obligations. Iraqi officials harassed inspectors and obstructed their work. Then, in 1998, something was brewing in the US. Removing the Iraqi government became an official US foreign policy with the enactment of the Iraq Liberation Act. The Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 is a United States congressional statement of policy stating that it should be the policy of the United States to support efforts to remove the regime headed by Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton and states that it is the policy of the United States to support democratic movements within Iraq, to establish a democratic government that respects human rights as defined internationally and is committed to the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. 1 month after the passage of the Iraq Liberation Act, the US and the UK launched a bombardment campaign of Iraq called Operation Desert Fox. The heart of the Desert Fox lists is the Iraqi regime itself, a half-dozen palace strongholds and their supporting cast of secret police, guard, and transport organizations. This, however, was but a glimpse of the bigger war that was to come. The real aggression would come later on, after the election of George W. Bush, the son.
I was not elected to serve one party.
You were not elected.
I hit a nerve.
Following the election of George W. Bush as president in 2000, the U.S. moved towards a more aggressive Iraq policy. The Republican Party's campaign platform in the 2000 election called for full implementation of the Iraq Liberation Act as a starting point in a plan to remove Saddam Hussein. Chapter 2. The Day the World Stood Still. And then, 9/11 happened.
It's unbelievable.
It was the sound of the first plane slamming into the North Tower that jolted then NYU student Caroline Dries and her roommate from their sleep.
Feeling of like being so vulnerable was so overwhelming. And so we ran out of the apartment, took the elevator down to the street, and it was just kind of pandemonium on the street with no one knowing what was happening.
This shocked the whole world, including the young me. I remember trembling upon seeing the imagery from the TV news reports. The planes crashing, the buildings collapsing, the people running and hearing their cries. This was so chilling and shocking for me. If I felt this strong shock witnessing this unfold hundreds of miles away from ground zero, what more for the American citizens witnessing this unfold right in front of their doorsteps, right in front of their eyes? This event greatly swayed US public opinion towards war on terrorism, and later, of course, aggression towards Iraq and Saddam Hussein. In the months leading up to the war, sizable majorities of Americans believed that Iraq either possessed WMDs or was close to obtaining them, that Iraq was closely tied to terrorism, and even that Hussein himself had a role in the 9/11 attacks. Following the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration's national security team actively debated an invasion of Iraq. On the day of the attacks, U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld asked his aides for best info fast, judge whether good enough hit Saddam Hussein at the same time, not only Osama bin Laden. From an archived CBS article, quote, CBS News has learned that barely 5 hours after American Airlines Flight 77 plowed into the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Donald H. Rumsfeld was telling his aides to come up with plans for striking Iraq, even though there was no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to the attacks. Now, nearly 1 year later, there is still very little evidence Iraq was involved in the September 11 attacks. But if these notes are accurate, that didn't matter to Rumsfeld. Go massive, the notes quote him saying. Sweep it all up, things related and not. End quote. The 9/11 attacks and terrorism were now being used to try to justify a planned invasion of Iraq, an obviously desired war. Although the defense secretary had yet to be pressed with any evidence linking the Iraqi leader to the World Trade Tower attacks, he was already considering whether the terrorist acts could be used as to justify a war on Iraq. However, during and after the Iraq invasion and war, many reports would come out to refute the ties made to connect Saddam to the 9/11 attacks. From Washington Post, quote, "Captured Iraqi documents in intelligence interrogations of Saddam Hussein and two former aides all confirmed that Hussein's regime was not directly cooperating with Al-Qaeda before U.S. invasion of Iraq, according to a declassified Defense Department report. The declassified version of the report also contains new details about the intelligence community's pre-war consensus that the Iraqi government and Al-Qaeda figures had only limited contacts, and about its judgments that reports of deeper links were based on dubious or unconfirmed information." End quote. Chapter 3. The Harbingers of Invasion. 9/11 presented an opportunity to build a case against Iraq. The Bush administration made the made-up link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda a linchpin in its justification for war. If we read the many reports about the pre-invasion and about the war, it seems a lot of dubious and unconfirmed intel has been passed on as acceptable information among the leadership and among the media, especially on intel about WMDs, despite challenges raised against the credibility of said information. Leaders convinced their people that the invasion and war was the only way to maintain security for their nation and people, and to maintain not only their peace, but the peace of other countries too. President Bush began laying the public groundwork for an invasion of Iraq in his January 2002 State of the Union address, calling Iraq a member of the Axis of Evil, and that Iraq is developing and manufacturing WMDs, saying that the United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. From the same State of the Union address,
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. They could provide these arms to terrorists, giving them the means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any of these cases, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons. Our war on terror has well begun, but it has only begun. This campaign may not be finished on our watch, yet it must be, and it will be, waged on our watch.
that speech is filled with politically and emotionally charged words. That's normal, of course, but it did sure do its magic. This was a notable start in the creation of a narrative to sell to their people that an invasion is an acceptable response to the threats of terrorism, threats from the axis of evil, threats from the development and manufacture of WMDs, if there ever were. Later that same year, 2002, other notable U.S. leaders echoed almost the same things from their president's State of the Union address. In August 2002, Dick Cheney declared, simply stated, there's no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. On CNN in September 2002, Condoleezza Rice claimed that aluminum tubes purchased by Iraq were only really suited for nuclear weapons programs. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud, she added. In October 2002, Bush said that Saddam Hussein had a massive stockpile of biological weapons. And in December 2002, Bush declared, we do not know whether or not Iraq has a nuclear weapon. All of these statements, of course, were refuted. For this claim, during this time, however, There was no confirmed intelligence at this point establishing that Saddam had revived a major WMD operation. This statement even shocked a general who, upon hearing Cheney's statement, couldn't believe the vice president was saying this. The same general also said he never saw one piece of credible evidence that there was an ongoing program of developing WMDs. For this claim, almost a year before, Ms. Rice's staff had been told that the government's foremost nuclear experts seriously doubted that the tubes were for nuclear weapons, that it is very possible the tubes were for non-nuclear purposes, but that it was very likely they were too. The experts at the Energy Department believed the tubes were likely intended for small artillery rockets. So, the claim that the aluminum tubes were only really suited for nuclear weapons is just false. For this claim, later on, this claim was proven to be erroneous and false. CIA had informed policymakers it had no specific information on the types or quantities of weapons agents or stockpiles at Baghdad's disposal. The massive stockpile was just literally made up. And finally, for this claim, intelligence reports, however, were not lacking. Though it is quite hard to ascertain how much percentage of the information was false and credible, even so, the Bush administration was given reports suggesting that Saddam did not have nuclear weapons and probably would have not been able to make one until 2007 and 2009. Bush did know whether or not Iraq had a nuclear weapon and lied and said he didn't know how to hype that threat. All of these statements can be interpreted in two ways. First, that they were all pro-invasion. Second, that they have to carefully deliver a well-crafted narrative to the public even if their information was questionable, so people's opinions could be swayed into pro-invasion and pro-war. And we have to remember, the same thing was done with the narrative created to try to link Saddam to Al-Qaeda. If it is still not obvious, yes, most of these allegations, which were considered as information, were also dubious and unconfirmed. However, the Bush administration did its best to connect Saddam with Al-Qaeda, and, using the pains caused by the 9/11 attacks and the fear they tried sowing by claiming Iraq had stockpiles of WMDs, the pro-invasion leaders definitely were successful in swaying public's opinion into favoring the invasion. They would even go as far as saying that Iraq is a country that aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda. Saddam did have connections with terrorist groups, but the gravity of the connection with Al-Qaeda from the claims by the pro-war people were very questionable. It was later found out that Saddam had no strong ties with Al-Qaeda. There's this very notable quote about President Bush from an author. Quoting an article from Al Jazeera, according to Melvin Leffler, author of the book Confronting Saddam Hussein, Bush never believed in a direct link between Hussein and Al-Qaeda. However, he believed the sanctions regime against Iraq was breaking down, that containment was failing, and that as soon as the sanctions were lifted, Hussein would restart his WMD program and blackmail the United States in the future. I thought by adding this quote, I was trying to be fair. However, I do remember seeing an Associated Press clip long ago where President Bush said some things about the link Saddam had to Al-Qaeda.
Oh, the reason I keep insisting that there was a relationship between Iraq and Saddam and Al-Qaeda, because there was a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
Chapter 4. The Mouthpiece for Invasion. What about the mainstream media? What part did it play in controlling the narrative? This is the most interesting part of the story for me about the Iraq War. The power of mainstream media to mold the narrative for the greater public and to sway their opinions always fascinated me. This deserves a separate study, but let me share a brief look on the involvement of media in selling the invasion plans and war to the masses. I have to point out ASAP that there were some media people that got it right. By that I mean they were right to raise doubts and questions about the validity, legality, and morality of the invasion and the war. They were never heard though. Either their voices were silenced by the shouts of the pro-invasion, or the authors and news anchors fired from their work. But of course, the focus here is more on the media groups that sold propaganda and pro-invasion narratives during this time. We must note early the dubious and unconfirmed reports shared by these bad actors in the mainstream media, especially by those seemingly who had an agenda. Their agenda could either be that these media people were simply pro-war, or it could simply be for the higher ratings and viewership of their stations. The mainstream media surely helped in shaping the opinions of people towards favoring the invasion and war with their coverage, which, intended or unintended, later on also became basis for anti-Muslim sentiments among the people consuming their questionable reports. And the propaganda definitely worked. People from both sides of the political spectrum reported on politicians and leaders supporting the plan of invasion and war, while they themselves, the media, also promoted the pro-invasion and propaganda. People were easily swayed by these reports because emotions were still high after the 9/11 attacks. Also, by not showing support or questioning the invasion, people might be seen or presented as being unpatriotic by the media. In an interview done by NPR with Noreen Malone, who hosted Season 5 of Slate's Slow Burn podcast, titled The Road to the Iraq War, Malone states, quote, "And I should say that it wasn't just people on the right who supported this. There were a lot of people who were liberal humanitarian interventionists, people at all places like the New Republic or Slate, which is where, we put together this podcast. At the time, a lot of people at those magazines, at those publications, also supported the Iraq War because they saw the potential for a humanitarian disaster." End quote. Growing up, we had cable that time, so I had access to the US mainstream media channels, where I watched reports about the invasion and the war. And watching those channels, yes, it was very notable that in these big media companies, pro-war was a very big message to deliver to the people. So, it should not be a surprise that when a study conducted in 2003 by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, tracking the frequencies of pro-war and anti-war commentators on the major US networks, that there were more pro-war views. That pro-war views were overwhelmingly more frequent. Just like the Bush administration, it felt like this pro-war mainstream media had to exaggerate not only their delivery but also the threats imposed by Saddam and his regime to the US citizens, to the Iraqis, and to the world, just so they'd be able to sell invasion and war to their viewers. Using politically charged and patriotic commentaries by their news anchors, using visually intense videos and pictures, and mixing all of this with intense music, sometimes accompanied by patriotic images like their flags, clips of patriotic Americans, and clips of their military, and sometimes sprinkled with strong words such as democracy, security, and freedom. These agenda-driven media companies were able to sell invasion and war to their viewers. Many of them acted more like cheerleaders, goading the people to agree with the invasion and war, and painting their government's decision to invade Iraq as something patriotic and brave. Their message definitely was heard. The mainstream media's voice was so strong that even some Iraqis, at first, somewhat believed it. Somewhat believed what they were saying. They thought if the US and its allies invaded, that democracy and peace would be achieved, and that Saddam and his regime would be ended, and thus finally helping the Iraqi people taste true democracy and freedom. They cheered for this prospect. Or maybe they just had to feign support, as the incoming foreign invaders were armed to the teeth. But that's how strong and big the influence of mainstream media was from the US. Many around the globe consumed their propaganda. Some believed it, many questioned it. To be fair, there were people from the mainstream media, inside and outside the US, that saw the war unjustified. Also, there were politicians, personalities, intellectuals, and even common citizens who were against the planned invasion and war. Anti-war sentiments were present.
Mr. Speaker, I do not know why the President feels despite what our intelligence agencies are saying, that it is so important to pass a resolution of this magnitude this week, and why it is necessary to go forward without the support of the United Nations and our major allies, including those who are fighting side by side with us in the war on terrorism. I agree with Brent Scowcroft, Republican former National Security Advisor for President George Bush Sr., who stated, and I quote, "An attack on Iraq at this time would seriously jeopardize, if not destroy, the global counterterrorist campaign we have undertaken," end quote. We should be clear that a war and a long-term American occupation of Iraq could be extremely expensive.
Other media personnel who were concerned of the pro-war sentiments sold by their fellow media men tried their best to bring reason and information for the people to see. They tried their best to report what was truthful and factual. That, during the war, some of them even risked their lives reporting from the battlegrounds in Iraq. Most importantly, a lot of them recognized the fact that the US media had done a poor job challenging the Bush administration's lies and manipulations during the march to war. In Iraq, many of us were personally determined to make amends through honest, critical reporting. Chapter 5: Selling the Invasion to the International Community. President Bush formally made his case to the international community for an invasion of Iraq in his September 12, 2002 address to the UN Security Council. Of course, this was met with criticisms and rebuke by nations who believed diplomatic solutions were far better than military actions. After considerable debate, on November 8, 2002, the UN Security Council adopted a compromise resolution, UN Security Council Resolution 1441, which authorized the resumption of weapons inspections and promised serious consequences for non-compliance. Security Council members, France and Russia, made clear that they did not consider these consequences to include the use of force to overthrow the Iraqi government. The US and the UK ambassadors to the UN publicly confirmed this reading of the resolution. Iraq accepted the resolution on November 13, 2002, and inspectors returned to Iraq. However, the pro-war narrative was already being molded and sold, and after selling it to the public and to the international community, the pro-invasion leaders now just had to act on it. In October 2002, the US Congress passed the Iraq Resolution, which authorized the president to use any means necessary against Iraq. Note that Americans polled in January 2003 still widely favored further diplomacy over invasion. However, later that year, Americans began to agree with the Bush plan of invasion. The US government engaged in an elaborate domestic public relations campaign to promote the war to its citizens. Americans overwhelmingly believed Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction. 85% said so. Around February 2003, also saw that 64% of Americans supported taking military action to remove Saddam from power. In the international scene, on February 5, 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell appeared before the UN to present evidence that Iraq was hiding unconventional weapons. He also presented alleged evidence linking Iraq to Al-Qaeda. Powell was told by the German intelligence agency that his information was untrustworthy. That's because in Powell's presentation, it included information from an informant who is already proven to have made false claims about Iraq. And what of the inspectors who were tasked to check whether Iraq had WMDs? They found nothing. No stockpiles of WMDs were ever found. It is worth noting that while 64% of Americans is said to have supported the idea of military action, the many parts of the world thought otherwise. On February 15, 2003, a coordinated day of protest was held across the world in which people in more than 600 cities expressed opposition to the imminent Iraq war. It was part of a series of protests and political events that had begun in 2002 and continued as the Iraq invasion, war and occupation took place. The day was described by social movement researchers as the largest protest event in human history. One protest in Rome involved 3 million people, and is considered the largest anti-war rally in history. March 2003. When asked about the reluctance among some UN Security Council members on the issue of military action against Iraq, Bush said, "As we head into the 21st century, when it comes to our security, we really don't need anybody's permission." So, which Security Council members were against taking military actions against Iraq? And what opinions did they have about the military actions? France, Russia, China, and Germany were against military actions. For France, military intervention would be the worst possible solution. For Russia, it deemed that there is no evidence that would justify a war in Iraq. China was worried and uneasy about the large-scale military buildup in the Gulf region, and that China's position in the potential war with Iraq was extremely close to France's. On January 22, German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, at a meeting with French President Jacques Chirac, said that he and Chirac would do all they could to avert the war. Meanwhile, the following Security Council members supported a military action even without the UN backing: the US, the UK, Bulgaria, and Spain.
I apologize for the fact that the intelligence we received was wrong. I can also apologize, by the way, for some of the mistakes in planning.
It would be a great failure on my part if I will not highlight the fact that way before the US and its allies sent their men to invade Iraq in 2003, in 2002, the CIA already had a team deployed in Iraq. This seems like a less common knowledge for many. But the CIA already had a team and special forces operators in Iraq that definitely played a big role in preparing the battle space for the 2003 Iraq invasion. The CIA team spent 9 full months in Iraq carefully preparing the battle space. They had been working the Iraqi military for a long time, destabilizing the regime. The operation had no official title, but the participants came up with their own name. They called their operation Operation Hotel California. The CIA advance team was also tasked with hunting WMDs, the Bush administration's primary reason for launching the war. But the CIA team mostly came up dry. Notable from this part of the story, however, is a quote from one CIA officer who was involved in said operation. "What is the point of even having an intelligence service, since no one is listening to the field intelligence?" Chapter 6. The Invasion. In an address to the nation on March 17, 2003, President George W. Bush gave Iraqi President Saddam Hussein and his sons a 48-hour ultimatum to leave Iraq. Then, on March 19, 2003, President Bush announced to the nation that the early stages of military operations against Iraq had begun. The operations were named Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Receiving end. Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth. Hey! Hey! Get back here! Hey, get back here!
You killed 1 million people in Iraq. It's incredible that you have the brass neck to be sitting here now
The Iraq war did not need to happen. It should not have happened. Iraq did nothing to us. And we killed 1 million Iraqi civilians, lost 5,000 plus American soldiers for what? It diminished our standing in the world. It damn near bankrupted our cause.
It's hard to believe it's been 20 years since then. I have really complex feelings about my time in the military. I think I was used. I think a lot of people in the military get used. I was 100% convinced about the mission at the beginning of the war. After 9/11, America was responding, and I was going to be a part of that response. But what I didn't know was how much fiction would be a part of my job.
But when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being dead. You sent me to Iraq. You sent me to Iraq in 2003. My friends are dead. Joshua Castile. You killed people. You lied. You lied about WMD. 1 million Iraqis are dead because you lied. My friends are dead because you lied. You need to apologize. Apologize.
After the war, at least 3 Fox 25 Marines died by suicide. One of them is in prison for murder after allegedly suffering from PTSD.
I think the nation didn't know what to do with a fresh round of combat veterans. What's the rule book for transitioning home?
These Marines are a snapshot of an alarming reality for American vets.
وين ابوك؟ وين؟ وين؟ مات. شلون تريقم غديم عشية؟
Let me put this out as early as now. I am biased towards the US just because I love some of what the US has to offer. I love their American pop culture. I like the ideas in their American dream. And of course, the American ideals on democracy and freedom. My country and our society had greatly been Americanized. That is why it was so easy for me to love many things that are American. Then, the Iraq War happened. This greatly changed how I see America now.
In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean, of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.